And Brian Etheridge, Sam Bradshaw from Sikkim365.com have been really, really good, where there's been a lot of stories about when is there going to be a deal, how much is it going to be, who is going to be included. Sam and Brian, they have their inside sources too, but Sam's been great, analytics, data, all that, like he does in breaking down opponents for Baylor football. What really is actually available? What is out there, linear television or whatever else? And they have an in-depth breakdown analysis of the streaming options and also the TV windows available. Sam, thank you very much for jumping on with this. Great stuff with you and Brian as always. So we get caught up sometimes, how much can they get, who's going to be involved, and I understand all that. How much is really on linear TV, television, regular television, how many spots are even available?
Thanks for having me on. And to really get into that, it's a difficult proposition for the Pac-12 right now. You've got the Big Ten basically taking all 14 weeks of Fox at noon, CBS in the afternoon, and NBC in prime time. And then you've got on NBC, half of their afternoon windows are going to be Notre Dame. The other half's probably going to NASCAR, horse racing, and PGA and whatnot. So they're booked there. And then prime time, it's going straight to the Big Ten. And then with Fox, they've kind of bowed out of the Pac-12 negotiations if what Dennis Dodd and what Brett McMurphy are reporting. So the network that was providing the Pac-12 most of their major platform windows on Fox, I mean, they had like 2-1 games on Fox versus ABC over the last few years. That's a lot of opportunity that's dried up. So depending on what level ABC, ESPN under Disney try to bid for their content, that's going to be their biggest opportunity to get some visible windows. But as we joked on the podcast, it's a bit of a knife fight to get those windows because other than the Big Ten going forward and the Mountain West for the remainder of this contract that has like a year or two left, everyone is on ABC, ESPN. Everyone wants a spot on ABC in the afternoon or prime time. Everybody wants ESPN afternoon or prime time. So it's going to be very competitive to get on those spots, even if you have a deal.
Sam, so if you had to guess what the Pac-12 contract specifically looks like now, when it's all said and done, how much linear, where is that, and how much is streaming?
I have no way of really knowing because I don't have any inside sources. I know Brian talks to a lot of people behind the scenes. I don't do that. I'm mainly looking at the data and what's publicly reported. So I'm not going to necessarily predict where those numbers come out because a lot of it's going to come out at what price will these leagues and be able to do a deal with these networks. For instance, Fox is rumored to not necessarily be a negotiating partner right now based off that reporting. But it sounds like, from what I'm seeing reported, is that if the Pac-12 dropped their price, Fox is like, yeah, I'll pick that up. So they could get some linear that way. And, ESPN might be willing to pick up more if the Pac would drop their price. The Pac-12 is kind of in a difficult spot because it's the inverse of what happened last contract negotiation for them. Last contract negotiation, Larry Scott benefited from a very interested Fox, very interested Disney, ABC, ESPN. But more importantly, there was a third bidder there. NBC Comcast that had the Versus network, but also wanted more games for big NBC. Well, that forced ESPN and Fox to effectively team up to give the level of exposure and payout that NBC was promising. Without that now, you're dealing with a situation where ESPN doesn't really have a whole lot of competition from major linear bidders, and most of their competition is coming from streaming services. Now, that's not a whole lot of reach and it's not a lot of visibility, and you're losing a lot of your casual viewership the more of your top-tier games go onto that. And across other conferences, you see league networks to a certain degree, but ESPN Plus carrying anywhere, streaming represents more like your bottom 20, 30% ideally of your content. You don't want it being your lead horse. You don't want it being that. So it's a difficult thing that Kliavkoff has to navigate. How do you piece together a deal that gets the payout your schools want for the number of years, because whatever network does a deal with them, they want to know that Oregon and Washington are sticking around, and can you get a grant of rights signed for that number of years? But can you get the payoff and exposure, and balancing all three elements of that across multiple partners and making sure it's not overly convoluted for the average fan to be visible on? It's a juggling act. And if he pulls it off, it'll be impressive.
Sam, I don't know, you might have mentioned it cut out, and I didn't hear that part, but how valuable do you feel like is like their most valuable piece, that late night Friday game? Like, where does that fall into of the utmost interest for networks, perhaps, in your mind?
In a perfect blank slate world, I don't know if it would be the most valuable time slot, but given what the networks already have signed under contract, it's probably the piece that's driving most of the demand they have right now. Because each of ESPN and Fox were getting about 10 to 15 games a year, depending on which network partner you're talking about, in that after dark window. And other than the Mountain West, or possibly playing FCS games like the Big Sky Conference, where like Montana or Sacramento State would be, other than doing something like that, the Pac-12 is really where you're going for those games. I mean, I know Fox and ESPN, depending on which conference you're talking about, could potentially draw a game that's a home game for BYU, UCLA, USC, and put it there. But that's highly variable in terms of where you fit in the draft order and who they happen to be playing that week. But yeah, it's the one part of it where they're the only power conference that can meet that demand. But you get into a return on investment debate. That window is expected to get around, I think, 1.6 million on ESPN, but less on other networks, on other cable networks. So at what point does the payout not break even, or become a risk to that break even, or become a risk to that profit margin? And I think that's what you're dealing with, is if they absolutely had to back away from the Pac-12, I feel like these networks could fill out their television windows across the noon, afternoon, and primetime slots, and really they'd only be out the after dark slot. So at what price does it make sense for those networks to fill that by paying the PAC? It probably makes sense at X, but it doesn't make sense at X plus Y.
Sam, obviously, Brett Yormark made a decision back in the fall to extend what the Big 12 had with Fox and also ESPN. Had he not done that, would the Pac-12 deal have been done about maybe 3, 4, 5, or 6 months ago?
I have no idea, because you don't know what numbers they were getting and how much they'd want to drive to the open market and see what they could get. So I'm not in the business of predicting what people would do in that environment. But I do think it's something that definitely benefited the Big 12, because you secured a lot of opportunity on Fox, FS1. You secured at least a seat at the table on ABC, ESPN. But as I mentioned before, that's a more competitive environment in order to get beneficial television windows. And while the Big 12 made the right move in doing so, I feel like the Big 12 would probably be facing a better prospect than the Pac-12 would be right now, because they could fill that noon slot for an NBC or a CBS. And the ratings threshold to make sense there is much, much lower than trying to fill CBS on a primetime slot, which typically CBS would only put a game in primetime if it was Bama versus LSU, Bama versus Georgia, Bama versus A&M, Notre Dame versus Georgia, something massive like that would like average 9 million viewers, something huge. So it's just a difficult proposition for them. And it's just a sign of a more difficult economy to sell in, with fewer interested bidders than they had last round.
All right, so you've heard and seen some of whoever might also be interested that's linear outside of networks, for example. I know initially when Ion was mentioned by Brett McMurphy, some spit on that, but maybe that's still there. Or the CW, which is available everywhere, in every city basically. What would that do if they ended up having to go there?
Well, if they got the CW, which is available everywhere, it probably wouldn't be good for ratings necessarily, because a lot of casual viewers just simply don't associate the CW with sports. But in terms of visibility and in terms of your fans being able to get your games, it would be good. As for whether it's good on the payout, it depends on what price they're willing to do it and whether or not that is an acceptable payout for the Pac-12. It just depends. But if it's going to be something where it's more of a syndication deal where it's on this channel in this market, this channel in that market, that's something that might be a little more difficult to swallow. But if it's something where it's one of your major network stations and it's the same everywhere, it wouldn't be as beneficial as getting an ABC or a Fox or a CBS or an NBC, but it'd be pretty solid considering some of their alternatives with streaming and whatnot.
All right, so ESPN, NBC, Fox, and CBS. We're going to use those. Those are the four, right? Those are the ones you want some sort of agreement or I guess, relationship with them. Of those four, which one do you think there's no chance that Pac-12 will be a part of?
No chance?
I would say the least amount of chance. Let's say that.
I don't see the need for NBC just because their prime time is chock full. They no longer are trying for a sports cable network, so I question the after dark need.
Mm-hmm.
And in the afternoon, you got half Notre Dame, half NASCAR / PGA / whatever. I see less need for them, but then again, I'm not in these guys' boardrooms. I don't know what ROI they're making on that other stuff. I don't know what flexibility those contracts have to shift things around. But just purely from that inventory standpoint, I think they're basically set in the time zone, in the time slots that Pacific time zone could potentially fill. Because you're not going to put a game on at 9 a.m. in the Pacific time zone just so it can be broadcast in the noon Eastern time slot. You're not going to do that. You cannibalize your ticket sales and other donations pretty quickly. I think ESPN is probably the most likely partner, and they've been reported to be the whole way. Fox apparently has stepped out, but again, it depends on the price that they're willing to sell for. If they come down in price, I'm sure all of them would potentially come to the table at some level. It's just a question of how much are you sacrificing payout for distribution, how much are you sacrificing distribution for payout.
Good stuff. Thank you, Sam. This also teases the story that in the segment, the podcast you have with Brian, and hopefully people go watch it, listen, read it, whatever else is a part of it. And we appreciate you jumping on. Also, the heads up that was going up in the site, and also you put it up on the Twitter feed. Thanks for your time as always.
Thank you, guys.
Sam Bradshaw, SicEm365.com during football season. He